But before doing that, I had this very burning question that I wanted to ask you, because you are a bit of an insider in the journalism industry, and mainly, I guess, like the economic outlets. But because you were basically implying that sort of certain political camps or certain agendas are taking over certain media or corporate media outlets. So I was wondering, like, who's taking over then the Financial Times, and who has taken over sort of the other media outlets like Wall Street Journal, Economist? Like, how would you describe that landscape?
I mean, it's not like, I wouldn't describe it as some sort of like political group or party. I think it's more of a movement, or a youth movement, really, that is focused on forwarding. So back in the day, like, obviously journalists were always part of unions. We had the National Union, of Journalists is a thing. But those unions were usually focused on forwarding the interests of journalists from a commercial, like from a simple kind of like, let's make sure they're paid properly, unionized to get a better deal and treatment and blah, blah, blah. But mostly it was to do with how you were treated as a journalist. Whereas I think now a lot more, there are organizations focused not just on like the treatment of journalists, they're focused on the content within the journalistic houses. So if there is a story that upsets any particular internal group, they will lobby for that story to be deprioritized, or they will lobby to have some input on that particular subject area, right? Because they feel that we shouldn't be platforming X, Y, or Z, or So I think there is a bit of a schism inside many journalistic outfits regarding these platforming issues, and the old school mentality really is that platforming doesn't mean endorsement. It means challenging someone. It means understanding who they are. It's about telling the story and often pushing back against what they're saying if they're saying nonsense, right? It's about entering into the spirit of debate and being aware of these pockets of, even when it comes to extremist situations, like you want to be able to interview, Lionel Barber interviewed Vladimir Putin, right? That is, we platformed Vladimir
editor of the
Putin,
FT, right?
Okay?
Is Lionel Barber.
Yeah, that was the former editor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is not seen as a bad thing in journalism. Never used to be. Mm-hmm. But these days, I think there is this like strange, I find it quite absurd that we can't platform certain like rogue operators, but we can others. And the FT hasn't been as bad as, I don't want to talk too much about the FT because obviously I still think it's one of the best papers in the world. Mm-hmm. And I still think it has incredibly sound practices. And I don't think what is happening to the FT is unique to the FT. I think it's a broader thing. And perhaps the FT is a bit more resistant to it actually than other areas, but
that's the
it is still happening.
Yeah. So, but who is? I'm still looking a little bit for the juicy details, though, Izabella. Like, who is not giving a platform, for example, and who is perhaps being giving too much of a platform, or is that the wrong way to say?
Well, I think there are some well-known stories that were recently, criticized. I think if anyone writes about anything controversial, they will get internal kind of pushback, whether it's about renewables or whether it's, stories about nuclear, or whether it's stories about trans, or whether it's stories about, Muslims in France. I mean, these are just a number of stories that have had internal pushback, right? So you
mean then, just to give a little bit of perspective for everybody watching, so you mean like, for example, nuclear may be good, or we can ask questions about the trans movement. Is that sort of the angles that are being pushed back against?
I mean, that issue isn't like a dominant one at the FT for obvious reasons, because it's not something that is paramount to markets and finance. But I do think there is a general, the lab leak story is one story that got, I think, unfairly sidelined. But that wasn't because of internal pushback. That was, I think, more because of stigma and fear. But yeah, I think if there is a sort of, I am pro-market, I'm capitalism in the old school sense of not crony capitalism. I'm pro
competition,
liberal democracy and all that, right? That's my position. But I do think that some of that is being challenged internally, and there is a growing kind of inclination to lean on the more, well, I don't know if it's leftist, but like I don't actually think left and right really is a fair descriptor these days of the big split in society. I think it's more about pro-state, pro-government, pro-centralization versus more decentralization, more kind of self-autonomous, libertarian. That's, I think, the split these days. And one tribe really resents and looks down on the other tribe. And they're both, I sit somewhere in the middle and I see the virtues and the downsides of both.
And
I think that's why for me...
tribe is strong. The decentralization tribe is pretty strong at the FT these days then, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I would think that it's very hard to operate nimbly.
But basically at most big media outlets, right? Are there any media outlets?
I can only speak for the ones that I've experienced myself, but yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I think I would love to dive a little bit more into the specifics. But would you have a look with me at what people are saying?
I don't want to. You've got to be open to. You've got to appreciate that I don't want to. Because I don't blame any particular person for what's going on. I think it's a broader trend, right? And I think a lot of this stuff is unwitting and. If you were to speak to another journalist at the FT, they would probably completely agree. Izzy's mad, it's all in her head. So I think there is no consensus on this. This is just my reading of the situation, and I have to stress that it made me feel uncomfortable. But I come from a very unique background. I'm Polish. My parents were, they experienced communism. They experienced like an oppressed environment. They experienced mass centralization and the inability to kind of, operate independently. That was my upbringing. So maybe I'm more tuned into these things than other people. I never used to be that tuned into that part of my history. But I think in recent years, I've come to really appreciate it. Because I think there is a sort of tendency to shut down challenging stories. And then there are other issues, which are just like legal liability issues. And that's, one of the, you're asking me very specific questions, but, as a journalist, I'm very aware of like libel, and I'm very aware of, what you can and cannot say without, a load of evidence to back up what you're saying. So, to make an off the cuff remark is in public, we were talking about journalism that is done with rigor, and you can't just make accusations without, you need a right of reply. It wouldn't be fair for me to make, that's why I don't want to, you're asking very pointed questions, but I don't think it's fair for me to comment outside the other perspective being in the room as well. So that's why I'm shying away from those questions.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's perhaps a little bit because I am on YouTube. I don't have that many people checking my work like in the similar spirit that you mentioned earlier. That might be helpful from time to time.
What I will say is that what I've personally noticed, and I think this is public domain, so it's not an issue, is that when you read the comments in the FT, I think there's a definite divide between those who sort of see it's still doing its job and they're very happy that it's become more of a campaigning newspaper and it's focused on, the new agenda is its motto, and, post-capitalism, moral money and compassionate capitalism and all this other stuff, right? So I'd say like half of that community really goes for it. But there's another half that I can see is, just from feedback, incredibly cynical about what's going on. And and laments for the days when Alphaville was a little bit more risque. And I think I want to service those readers because I can see that they are being left out. And I think there's also this is my impression and I could be wrong, but I feel that they feel like they're being patronized a little bit by their newspaper. Yeah. And I don't think that is a good sort of relationship to have with your readers. And, whether there is a perspective or not that like a lot of the readers are old dinosaurs that are outdated and should be, city people, the old city stereotype. And, but at the end of the day, that they're the people that pay your salary. So it's like telling them they're awful, horrible people all the time is not constructive, I don't think.
Yeah. No, well, maybe I can give a small example myself as well, and then I will definitely move to the comments. I know I promised it multiple times already, but I see it with the inflation story as well, where I am actually going in a little bit sort of on the they would say, I think, dovish side, because I am in a different world. I'm in YouTube space where the other the sort of hyperinflation is coming narrative is extremely strong. But what I also see is that at the more established outlets, they don't want to address serious concerns about inflation, for example, right? Like that, for example, house prices are not in the inflation index. People comment that quite often, that it's ridiculous. Well, I do push back then often, in the sense that I say, well, but a house is a consumption asset and it's an investment asset. So there are reasons for this. And it's not necessarily a big conspiracy, but I do try to at least shed light on the subject and to take it seriously, because for many people, it doesn't matter because their house prices are going up. They can no longer live in the city. So who cares? It's an investment asset. And so I do see that many of the more sort of established corporate outlets, then just totally go the other way. So I think there's then often the middle ground is lacking a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if this fits in.
I would agree.
Excellent.
Well, and I think that's what I always aspired to do on Alphaville, is just to be able. So I think people kind of confuse that sometimes I kind of try on a different hat to see things from a different perspective, because I think that teaches you valuable insights about what's going on. And unless you have the capacity to see things from a different point of view, you do. I mean, the cliche, you have a blind spot. And that doesn't necessarily mean that when I'm trying on this other hat, I necessarily agree with everything on that position, right?
Yeah.
It's more like when you focus a camera, you just want to see the different perspectives to get the optimal view. But there is a lot of like resistance, I think, these days to trust just looking at things from a different perspective. I think that one of the good examples of this is the BBC, which everybody seems to hate. Like whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, like everybody seems to hate the BBC. And I too am critical of one thing about the BBC. I do think over COVID they really leaned into the kind of like terror side of things, but so did all the other media, and it was a very packed journalism thing. But that said, my general take on the BBC is the fact that everyone hates them probably means they're doing the right thing, because obviously that means they are looking at things from different perspectives. And if everyone thinks that they're being discriminated against in favor of the other side, well, probably that's just them being very sensitive. So I tend to defend the BBC on that front.